The crystal chandeliers of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant trembled when Don Salvatore walked in. He demanded respect in a dead Sicilian dialect no outsider knew. When the terrified translator choked, a shy waitress stepped out of the shadows. Her flawless response didn't just freeze the room, it exposed a deadly 20-year-old secret. The onyx-paneled dining room of La Ora, Manhattan's most notoriously exclusive dining establishment, felt less like a restaurant and more like a fortress tonight. Located discreetly off Park Avenue, La Ora catered to billionaires, corrupt politicians, and men whose names were whispered rather than spoken. But even by the restaurant's lofty standards, the atmosphere in the kitchen was suffocatingly tense. Elena adjusted the starched white collar of her uniform, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed down her black apron. She was 23, unassuming, and fiercely dedicated to remaining entirely invisible. For the past 3 years, Elena had perfected the art of blending into the background. She spoke softly, kept her gaze directed at the floorboards, and never asked questions. In a city of 8 million people, anonymity was her only armor against a past she had spent her entire life running from. "They're sweeping the private dining room again," whispered Sophia, a fellow waitress, her eyes wide as she peeked through the porthole of the swinging kitchen doors. "Bomb-sniffing dogs. Elena, I'm not kidding. And they've jammed all the cell signals." Elena didn't look up from polishing the Riedel crystal wine glasses. "Just keep your head down, Sophia. Pour from the right, clear from the left. Don't look them in the eye." Tonight, the restaurant was closed to the public. Only one party had booked the entire establishment: the Silvestri family. To the NYPD and the FBI, the Silvestris were an untouchable syndicate controlling the eastern seaboard's shipping ports. To the staff at La Ora, they were simply a group of men who required absolute perfection, or else. At the center of this storm was Dante Silvestri. Elena had seen Dante twice before. He was the reigning head of the American faction, a man who possessed the lethal grace of a predator and the polished exterior of a Wall Street titan. He wore bespoke Tom Ford suits, spoke in a quiet, chilling baritone, and had a gaze that felt like a physical weight. Every time Dante entered the room, the oxygen seemed to evaporate. He was ruthlessly pragmatic, modern, and entirely unforgiving. But tonight was different. Tonight, Dante was not the apex predator. He was the host. "Chef needs the truffle shaved for the risotto, now," barked Chef Laurent, his face flushed with a mixture of culinary passion and sheer terror. "And Elena, you are on the private suite tonight. You will handle the wine service." Elena's heart dropped into her stomach. "Chef, please, send Tomas. He's the senior sommelier." "Tomas is having a panic attack in the walk-in freezer," Laurent snapped, wiping his brow with a towel. "You know the cellar better than anyone, and you have the quietest footsteps. You are a ghost, Elena. Tonight, I need a ghost." A ghost. That was exactly what she had trained herself to be. Taking a deep, stabilizing breath, Elena loaded her silver tray with 2 decanters of a rare 2010 Tenuta dell'Ornellaia Macedo. She walked through the double doors, leaving the chaotic noise of the kitchen behind. The main dining area was eerily silent, guarded by men in tailored suits with distinct bulges beneath their jackets. Elena kept her eyes averted as she approached the heavy oak doors of the private VIP suite, the Onyx room. Inside, the long mahogany table was set for 12, but only 2 seats at the head were emphasized. Dante Silvestri was already there, flanked by his underboss, Leo, and his consigliere, a sharp-eyed lawyer named Arthur. Dante looked tense. The usual icy composure that made him so terrifying was currently fractured by a subtle, rigid anticipation. He kept checking a heavy gold Patek Philippe watch. Elena moved like a phantom, stepping silently onto the plush Persian rug. She approached the credenza to stage the wine, her movements fluid and rehearsed. "If he thinks he can dictate the union terms from Palermo, he's out of his mind," Leo was saying, his voice low and grating. "The docks are ours, Dante." "He is the Don," Dante replied, his voice a smooth, dangerous murmur that made Elena's spine tingle. "He dictates whatever he pleases. Our job tonight is to ensure the transition of the old guard to the new without a bloodbath. When my father arrives, No one speaks unless spoken to. You show him the respect of a king. If he insults you, you swallow it. Elena froze, her hand hovering over a crystal glass. His father, Don Salvatore Silvestri, the ghost of Palermo. He was a myth among the modern syndicates, a ruthless, old-school Sicilian boss who rarely left the shores of Italy. He despised the Americanized mafia, viewing them as soft, flashy, and undisciplined. For Salvatore to fly to New York meant the tension between the old country and the new empire had reached a breaking point. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors swung open. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. Elena pressed herself back against the shadows of the credenza, her breath catching in her throat. She gripped the edge of the silver tray to stop her hands from shaking as the most dangerous man in the Western Hemisphere walked into the room. Don Salvatore Silvestri did not look like a movie mobster. He was not towering, nor was he adorned in flashy jewelry. He was a man of modest height, perhaps in his late 60s, wearing a masterfully tailored charcoal suit that looked deceptively simple. He walked with a silver-tipped cane, his steps slow and deliberate, but it was his face that commanded absolute terror. His eyes were like chips of black flint, cold, ancient, and entirely devoid of mercy. His skin was weathered by the Mediterranean sun, and a jagged, pale scar cut across his left cheekbone. He radiated an aura of absolute, uncontested authority. Behind him trailed 4 massive bodyguards, fresh off the plane from Sicily, their eyes scanning the room with lethal intent. Dante stood up immediately, buttoning his jacket. The tension between father and son was a tangible, electric current. "Papa," Dante said, stepping forward. He extended a hand, but Salvatore ignored it. Instead, the older man grabbed Dante by the back of the neck, pulling him into a brief, aggressive embrace, kissing both his cheeks before pushing him back. Salvatore muttered something under his breath. It wasn't standard Italian. It was rough, guttural, and clipped. Elena, standing invisible by the wine station, felt a violent jolt hit her chest. The world tilted on its axis. She understood him. It wasn't just Italian. It was Siciliano. And not just the general dialect. It was the deep, hyper-specific coastal dialect of Trapani, an ancient linguistic variation spoken only by a few insular families in the western mountains of Sicily. It was the exact dialect her grandfather used to speak to her before he was gunned down on their front porch in Castellammare del Golfo 16 years ago. The dialect she had buried deep in her memory when her mother smuggled her on a cargo ship to America to hide from the rival families. "Sit," Salvatore commanded in heavy Italian, waving a dismissive hand. The men around the table scrambled to take their seats. The dinner commenced, and it was a disaster waiting to happen. Elena moved silently, pouring the Massetto wine, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She observed the dynamic at the table. Dante was trying to negotiate the union contracts for the Brooklyn shipyards, speaking in polished, standard Tuscan Italian. Salvatore was deliberately ignoring him, dissecting his veal chop with surgical precision. The Don brought his own translator, a slick, nervous Italian-American named Carlo, who was sweating profusely. Salvatore refused to speak standard Italian. He viewed it as a weakness, an appeasement to the northern politicians he despised. He only spoke in his native Trapanese dialect, forcing Carlo to translate for the American faction. "Tell my son," Salvatore rasped, setting his knife down, "that a dog who wears a silk collar is still just a dog. He barks at the harbor, but he does not bite." Carlo swallowed hard, his face pale. The Don says, "He says you have nice suits, Dante, but the harbor requires more aggression." Salvatore's eyes snapped toward Carlo. He slammed his fist onto the table, the silver cutlery rattling against the porcelain. "Si nu babu," Salvatore snarled, his voice echoing like thunder in the cavernous room. "Chistu aiutu traduturi? Nudu capish nenti si. You are an idiot. This is your translator? Nobody understands anything here." Dante's jaw tightened. "Papa, please. Carlo is from Milan. He is doing his best with your dialect." "My dialect is the blood of this family," Salvatore roared, standing up. The bodyguards behind him instantly placed their hands inside their jackets. Dante's men mirrored the movement. The room was one wrong breath away from a massacre. "You bring me to this glass cage," Salvatore spat, gesturing wildly at the opulent room in his thick Trapanese tongue. "Mi rasi emanciari stimundizia? Unni sunu I veri sapuri? Unni elaggia, loggiu bonu. Mi voliti avvelenari custi salsi di burro d'America." Carlo, the translator, looked like he was about to pass out. He says, he doesn't like the food. He wants olive oil? It was a pathetic mistranslation. Salvatore had insulted the very honor of Dante's hospitality, accusing them of serving him garbage disguised with American butter, demanding to know where the true flavors of garlic and pure oil were, essentially calling Dante a sanitized, fake Italian. Salvatore sneered, absolute disgust radiating from his weathered face. He reached for his cane. "We are done. I leave tonight. The ports go to the Rossi family." Dante stood up, panic finally cracking his stoic facade. Losing the ports meant losing the city. "Papa, wait. Let me get a different translator. Let me." "Nudu ccia rintra sapiu me sayatu," Salvatore interrupted, turning his back. "No one in here knows my breath, my soul." Elena stood by the wall holding a silver pitcher of ice water. Her hands were gripping the handle so tightly her knuckles were white. The trauma of her past was screaming at her to stay quiet, to remain the ghost. If she spoke, she would be seen. If she was seen by the Sicilian Mafia, the very people who might have killed her family, she could be dead by morning. But as Salvatore took a step toward the door, severing his son's empire, something archaic and fierce flared inside Elena's chest. It was the pride of her grandfather, the pride of the mountains. Before her brain could stop her, Elena stepped away from the wall. "La Giabona non si metti sutta u burro, Don Salvatore." Elena's voice rang out. It was soft, but in the dead silence of the room, it sounded like a gunshot. "Si metti ente manu di chi sapi travagliare la terra." Good garlic isn't hidden under butter, Don Salvatore. It is placed in the hands of those who know how to work the earth. The entire room froze. Dante whipped his head around, staring at the shy waitress he had barely noticed for the past 2 hours. His dark eyes were wide with a shock he couldn't mask. The underbosses stopped breathing. The bodyguards tensed, unsure who the threat was. Don Salvatore stopped dead in his tracks. He slowly turned around, leaning heavily on his cane. His black eyes locked onto Elena, piercing right through her uniform, searching her very soul. He didn't just hear his native tongue. He heard the exact inflection of the western coast. He heard the archaic grammatical structure that hadn't been spoken outside of a 5-mile radius of Trapani in 50 years. Salvatore took a slow step toward her. The air was so thick, it felt like trying to breathe underwater. "E tu così, figia?" Salvatore asked, his voice a dangerous, hushed whisper. "And who are you, child?" Elena stood her ground. She met the gaze of the most terrifying man in the Mafia world, and for the first time in 16 years, she stopped hiding. "Sugnu chidachi, vi versa uvinu," Elena replied perfectly, seamlessly pouring a fresh glass of the Maceto and holding it out to him without a tremor in her hand. "E sugnu chidda chi vi rice di assettarivi picchiu vinu bonu nun si lassa fare a citupum malintesu." I am the one who pours your wine, and I am the one telling you to sit down, because good wine shouldn't be left to turn to vinegar over a misunderstanding. The silence that followed was deafening. No one spoke to the Don like that. Not his capos, not his enemies, and certainly not his son. To command him to sit down was a death sentence. Dante took a half step forward, his voice a frantic hiss. "Elena, step back immediately." Salvatore raised a single, scarred finger. Dante instantly fell silent. The Don stared at Elena's face. His eyes traced the shape of her jaw, lingering for a fraction of a second on the faint, pale scar near her ear. A strange, unrecognizable emotion flickered in the old man's eyes. It looked terrifyingly like recognition. Without breaking eye contact with Elena, Don Salvatore reached out and took the glass of wine from her tray. He took a sip. Then, he turned to his son. "Sit down, Dante," Salvatore commanded, his voice suddenly calm, slipping into perfect, unaccented English. And fire that useless translator. The waitress is sitting with us. The heavy oak chair scraped against the floorboards, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the frozen silence of the Onyx room. Dante, driven by an instinct he didn't quite understand, stepped forward and pulled the chair out for Elena. His dark eyes, usually unreadable and cold, were burning into her profile. Elena stood, rooted to the spot, her silver pitcher still clutched in her hands. She was a waitress earning minimum wage, hiding in the shadows of Manhattan, and the supreme head of the Sicilian underworld had just ordered her to sit at his right hand. "Sit, child," Don Salvatore repeated, his flawless English devoid of any accent. It was a terrifying parlor trick. The old man had allowed the American faction to believe he couldn't understand them, playing the fool while absorbing every whispered plot and misstep. Trembling, Elena handed the pitcher to a bewildered underboss and slowly sank into the plush leather chair. She kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, acutely aware of the warmth radiating from Dante as he took the seat to her immediate left. The scent of his expensive cedarwood cologne mixed with the sharp, metallic tang of fear in the room. Salvatore leaned forward, resting his chin on his hands. He ignored the dozen armed men, his son, and the cold dinner. He looked only at Elena. "There are perhaps 50 people left in the world who speak the pure dialect of the Western Cliffs," Salvatore said, his voice dropping to a conversational murmur that somehow carried more menace than a shout. "It is a dead language, a language of ghosts. The people who spoke it were wiped out in the massacre of the Castellamare coast nearly 2 decades ago. Do you know of this?" Elena swallowed hard, her throat painfully dry. "I have read history, sir." "History," Salvatore mused, a cruel smile touching the corner of his lips. He reached across the table, his weathered fingers suddenly gripping her chin with terrifying speed. Dante flinched, his hand moving instinctively toward his jacket, but a sharp glance from his father kept him frozen. Salvatore tilted Elena's face toward the harsh light of the crystal chandelier, his thumb brushing the faint, jagged scar just below her left ear. A grazing wound from a high-caliber rifle. The kind of scar a child gets when she is carried out of a burning villa while her family is slaughtered behind her. "Tell me, ghost, what is your family name?" The room stopped breathing. Dante stared at the scar, a sudden, fierce protectiveness clenching in his chest. He had seen Elena every week for 3 years. She was the invisible girl who knew exactly how he liked his scotch, the one who stepped out of the way when his men walked through the halls. He had never truly looked at her. Now, he couldn't look away. Beneath the plain uniform and the frightened exterior was a woman possessed of a profound, lethal stillness. "My name is Elena," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Elena what?" Salvatore demanded, his grip tightening just a fraction. She met his dead, flinty eyes. The instinct to survive screamed at her to lie, but the pride of her bloodline, dormant for 16 years, suddenly caught fire. "Elena Falcone," a collective gasp rippled through the older men at the table. Dante's consigliere, Arthur, went completely pale, gripping the edge of the mahogany table. The Falcone family was a legend. They were the original lords of the western ports, the only syndicate that had ever successfully defied Don Salvatore's father. They were wiped out in a single, bloody night. The official story was that no one survived. Salvatore released her face, leaning back in his chair with a heavy sigh. He looked older suddenly, the weight of the past settling on his shoulders. "I knew your grandfather. We were enemies, yes, but we respected the old ways. When the hit was ordered on his compound, it was not by my hand. It was an act of cowardice, orchestrated by traitors who sought to curry favor with the American factions." Dante's jaw locked. He leaned closer to Elena, his broad shoulders shielding her slightly from the rest of the room. "Papa," Dante said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "What does this have to do with the union negotiations tonight?" "Everything," Salvatore snapped, his eyes flashing. "Because the man who sold the Falcone family to the assassins, the man who opened the gates of the compound and watched them burn, is sitting at this very table." Elena's heart stopped. She slowly turned her head, looking at the faces of the men surrounding her. Her breath hitched. "Look closely. Elena Falcone, Salvatore commanded softly. "Who ordered the hit on your blood?" Elena's eyes swept past Dante's underboss, Leo, and landed on a man sitting near the end of the table. He was older, dressed in a flamboyant gray suit, sweating profusely into his silk collar. Marco Varelli. He was one of Dante's most trusted capos in New York, the man who controlled the very Brooklyn shipyards they were currently fighting over. Elena had served him wine 100 times. She had smiled at him, cleaned his spilled ashes, and bowed her head to him, entirely unaware that she was serving the architect of her family's destruction. "Marco Varelli," Salvatore said, letting the name hang in the heavy air. "You thought the old country had forgotten. You thought the ocean would wash away the blood." Marco leaped to his feet, his chair crashing backward onto the Persian rug. "This is insane. Don Salvatore, with all due respect, you are listening to a waitress, a nobody." "I have bled for this family." "You bled for money," Dante interrupted, his voice like cracking ice. The pieces were finally clicking together in Dante's mind. He stood up, towering over the table, his presence dominating the room. He stepped firmly between Marco and Elena. 2 months ago, I found a discrepancy in the harbor ledgers. A ghost payment from an offshore account, wired 20 years ago and buried in shell corporations. Dante pulled a folded document from his breast pocket and tossed it onto the table. Exactly $200,000. I assumed it was a bribe for a customs agent. I didn't realize it was the price of a massacre. The revelation hit the room like a physical shockwave. Marco Varelli stared at the paper, his face draining of all color. He looked frantically at the other capos. But the men who had been laughing with him an hour ago were now staring at him with cold, predatory eyes. In their world, betrayal was a contagious disease. No one wanted to stand near the infected. "Dante, listen to me," Marco stammered, raising his hands in a placating gesture while taking a slow step backward toward the heavy oak doors. "The Falcones were out of control. They were bad for business. I did what had to be done to secure the shipping lanes for us. For our future, you broke the absolute law of the old country," Salvatore said softly, not bothering to stand. "You killed women. You killed children. You took $200,000 to slaughter a family while they slept. And then you fled to America to hide behind my son." Elena sat paralyzed, her vision blurring. The memories she had spent a lifetime burying violently clawed their way to the surface. The smell of smoke, the deafening roar of gunfire, shattering the tranquil Sicilian night. The heavy, lifeless weight of her mother pushing her beneath the floorboards of the wine cellar. She didn't realize she was hyperventilating until she felt a warm, strong hand gently grip her shoulder. Dante was looking down at her, his dark eyes stripped of their usual ruthless calculation. In that fleeting moment, he wasn't looking at a waitress, nor was he looking at a pawn in a mafia power struggle. He was looking at a survivor. He was looking at royalty. "Breathe, Elena," Dante whispered, his voice an anchor in the storm of her panic. "Don't let him leave." Elena choked out, the words tearing from her throat before she could stop them. She looked up at Dante, her brown eyes blazing with a sudden, feral intensity. "Please." Dante's expression hardened into something terrifying. He didn't just nod, he made a silent vow. Marco, realizing the room had turned into an execution chamber, lunged for the door. He was fast for an older man, but Dante's bodyguards were faster. Before Marco's hand even grazed the brass handle, 2 massive enforcers slammed him against the mahogany panels. "Get your hands off me!" Marco shrieked, struggling uselessly against the grip of the guards. "Dante, I am a made man! You cannot do this without a commission vote. You cannot kill me over a ghost from 20 years ago." "You are right, Marco," Dante said smoothly, walking slowly toward the struggling man. He casually adjusted his cufflinks, his demeanor chillingly calm. "I cannot kill you over a 20-year-old vendetta from a different territory. That would be a breach of protocol." Marco stopped struggling, a desperate, pathetic glimmer of hope lighting up his eyes. "Exactly. We have rules, Dante. We are businessmen." Dante stopped mere inches from Marco, his towering frame blocking the light. "However," Dante continued, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You lied to me about the harbor ledgers. You stole $200,000 through my territory to fund your cowardice. And worse." Dante slowly turned his head, his gaze locking onto Elena, who was watching him with wide, tear-filled eyes. The undeniable pull between them, a tension that had been quietly brewing for 3 years under the guise of anonymity, finally snapped into sharp, undeniable focus. "You raised your voice to the last living heir of the Falcone family. Under my roof," Dante finished. Don Salvatore watched his son with a mixture of surprise and profound approval. The old Don slowly tapped his silver-tipped cane against the floor. "She is not your jurisdiction, Dante. The girl belongs to the old country. She is Sicilian blood. The right of vengeance is hers, or it is mine." Dante turned back to his father, the air between them crackling with defiance. "She has lived in my city for 3 years, Papa. She has walked my floors and breathed my air. She isn't a ghost anymore. She is under my protection." The dealination sent a shockwave through the room. Dante Silvestri, the ruthless, pragmatic king of the modern American Mafia, had just publicly claimed a waitress. He had drawn a line in the sand, not over territory or money, but over a woman with nothing to her name but a tragic history and a scarred cheek. Elena stood up. Her legs were shaking, but she forced herself to stand tall. She stepped away from the table, moving past the staring capos, and walked toward Dante. She didn't look at Marco, who was now weeping openly against the door. She looked only at Don Salvatore. "I don't want his blood on my hands," Elena said, her voice steady and clear, ringing out in the quiet room. "The Falcone family was destroyed by violence. I will not rebuild it the same way. I want him ruined. I want every cent he owns stripped away. I want him cast out, without a name, without a family, and without a home. Let him live as a ghost. Let him see how it feels." Salvatore studied her, his black eyes unreadable. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound in the room was Marco's pathetic sobbing. Finally, the old Don smiled. It was a terrifying, genuine smile. "The blood of your grandfather truly flows in your veins, Elena Falcone," Salvatore rasped. He looked at Dante. "Strip him. Take his assets, his properties, his territories. Leave him nothing but the clothes on his back, and throw him onto the street. If anyone offers him a glass of water, they answer to me." Dante nodded once to his guards. They dragged the sobbing, broken Marco Varelli out of the private suite, tossing him into the cold reality of the night. The immediate threat was gone, but the heavy reality of the situation crashed down on Elena. She was exposed. The anonymity she had fiercely protected was shattered into a million pieces. She was Elena Falcone once more, and in this world, that name was a target. She took a shaky step backward, her sudden exhaustion threatening to pull her under. Before she could fall, Dante's arm wrapped securely around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. The heat of his body, the solid, unyielding strength of him, grounded her instantly. "You're safe," Dante murmured, his lips brushing against her ear. "Meant for her and her alone. I swear on my life, you are safe." Don Salvatore stood up, leaning heavily on his cane. He looked at the shattered crystal on the floor, the abandoned dinner, and finally at his son, holding the lost heir of his greatest rival. "The union negotiations are concluded," Salvatore announced, his voice carrying the absolute finality of a king. "The Brooklyn ports belong to you, Dante. But the girl changes everything. You have claimed a queen, my son. Now you must prepare for a war." The transition from the suffocating tension of the Onyx room to the insulated silence of Dante's armored Maybach happened in a blur. Elena sat rigid against the plush leather seats, the city lights of Manhattan painting fleeting shadows across her pale face. The heavy doors of Lara were closed behind her forever. She was no longer the invisible waitress pouring wine. She was a Falcone, a name that carried the weight of a slaughtered dynasty. Dante sat beside her, radiating a fierce, protective heat. He had immediately ordered a total lockdown, his security detail, operating with the precision of a Tier 1 military unit, flanked their vehicle in 2 black SUVs. "My father is returning to the island tonight on his Gulfstream. Dante finally said, breaking the heavy silence. His voice was a low, soothing rumble in the quiet cabin. He has already contacted the elders. By tomorrow morning, the deed to the Falcone estate in the Western Mountains will be transferred out of the shell corporations and placed into a private trust at Goldman Sachs. In your name, Elena turned her head, her breath hitching. I don't want the estate, Dante. I don't want the money. I just wanted the man who betrayed my mother to look me in the eye and know he failed. Dante reached across the console, his large, calloused hand gently covering hers. The warmth of his touch sent a jolt of electricity straight to her heart. You don't have to take the land, Elena, but you must take the power it represents. In this life, weakness is an invitation. You proved tonight that you are anything but weak. Before Elena could respond, a deafening screech of tires shattered the night. The Maybach lurched violently as a heavily modified truck slammed into the lead security SUV, sending it spinning across the wet asphalt of the West Side Highway. Sparks showered the darkness as a second vehicle boxed them in from behind. Down! Dante roared, throwing his massive frame over Elena, shielding her body with his own just as the reinforced glass of the passenger window took a barrage of high-caliber fire. The bulletproof glass spiderwebbed, but held firm. Marco, Dante snarled, pulling a sleek, dark weapon from the shoulder holster beneath his tailored jacket. He knew he was dead the moment my father stripped him. This is his final, desperate play. He hired the O'Connor Syndicate's rogue enforcers to take us out before the Elder Council can ratify his excommunication. Panic gripped Elena's chest. But as she looked at Dante, a sudden, piercing clarity washed over her. The ghost of the frightened little girl hiding in the cellar vanished, replaced by the hardened survivor who had spent 16 years navigating the shadows. She was a Falcone. She would not die cowering in the back of a car. The glass won't hold another volley, Elena said, her voice eerily calm over the chaos outside. She reached down, her fingers wrapping around the cold steel of the spare weapon Dante kept holstered in the door panel. Dante looked at her, his dark eyes wide with a mixture of shock and profound awe. He didn't tell her to drop it. He didn't treat her like a fragile civilian. He gave her a sharp, affirming nod. On 3, my driver drops the suspension and hits the ramming gear. We push through the barricade. Stay low, and if anyone gets through that door, you don't hesitate. I know, she whispered, her grip tightening on the grip. 1, Dante counted, his muscles coiling like a predator. 2, 3. The Maybach's engine roared like a caged beast. The armored vehicle surged forward with terrifying force, smashing into the rear quarter of the blocking truck. Metal groaned and shattered. Gunfire erupted from Dante's remaining security team, neutralizing the O'Connor enforcers in a swift, brutal crossfire. The Maybach tore through the opening, leaving the burning wreckage behind. 30 minutes later, they arrived at Dante's secure penthouse, overlooking Central Park. The doors locked behind them with a heavy, metallic thud, sealing them inside the fortress of glass and steel. Dante tossed his weapon onto the marble console and immediately turned to Elena. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his eyes frantically scanning her for injuries. Are you hurt? Did any glass hit you? I'm fine, she breathed, the adrenaline slowly leaving her system, leaving her trembling. She looked up at the towering, ruthless king of the city, seeing the raw, unfiltered terror in his eyes, terror for her. Dante, I'm fine. He let out a ragged breath, pulling her flush against his chest. He buried his face in her hair, holding her so tightly she could feel the frantic beating of his heart. For 3 years, I watched you, he confessed, his voice thick with emotion. I watched you move through my restaurant like a shadow. I told myself I was just observing an excellent employee, but I was captivated. And tonight, when you stepped out of the dark and challenged a king, I knew I would burn this entire city to the ground before I let anyone harm you. Elena looked up, her brown eyes locking onto his. The space between them vanished. Dante's lips crashed down on hers, fierce and consuming. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a vow. Elena surrendered to the heat of it, her hands tangling in his dark hair, anchoring herself to the only man who truly saw her. The next morning, the absolute weight of Dante's karma fell upon Marco Varelli. Marco had attempted to flee the country via a chartered flight at Teterboro Airport. He was intercepted not by Mafia hitmen, but by Dante's private intelligence team. Following Elena's exact wishes, Marco was not killed. Instead, Dante's hackers drained every offshore account Marco possessed, funneling the millions into anonymous charities. Stripped of his wealth, his men, and his Mafia protection, Marco was handed over to a federal task force with a neatly packaged dossier of his financial crimes. He was sentenced to life in the ADX Florence maximum security prison, locked in a concrete box for 23 hours a day. He was a ghost, left to rot in absolute agonizing poverty, precisely as Elena had demanded. Months later, the Onyx room at Lara was once again filled with the most powerful men in the syndicate. But the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. Dante sat at the head of the long mahogany table, unquestioned and unrivaled, and seated to his right, wearing a tailored midnight blue suit and radiating the quiet, lethal authority of her ancestors, was Elena Falcone. She was no longer the girl who poured the wine. She was the queen who owned the vineyard, ruling the empire side by side with the man who loved her enough to let her roar. The silence of a shy waitress toppled an empire and built a new one. Elena and Dante's story proves that the deepest secrets always find the light. Thank you for listening to this thrilling Mafia romance. If her flawless dialect left you frozen, hit that like button, share this story with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more gripping, real-life drama. See you in the next video.